their techniques for levitation, because essentially I think it's our desire to free ourselves from the material world and journey off into the spiritual world.
A journey undertaken not only by magicians. In 1868, a Westerner claimed that he too could really fly, but that this wasn't to do with magic. It was due to the power of spiritualism.
The most famous spiritualist medium of the Victorian period was Daniel Hume, or D.D. Hume, as he was called. He conducted seances for virtually everyone who was anybody in the Victorian period, and he became a huge celebrity. He conducted seances for the Tsar of Russia, for Napoleon III. At his seances, he would levitate up to the ceiling. Hume's most famous levitation is called the Ashley Place levitation. He is supposed to have floated out of a window in an upper story flat in London and then floated in the adjacent window. 3 people were present, 2 accounts were given. They don't quite match up, but they agree on some details. There's been decades and decades of controversy in the world of psychical research about how this levitation could have taken place.
Even though he did it in the dark, evidence was shown later by the fact there was handwriting on the ceiling.
There was a massive upsurge in interest in spiritualism in the mid-19th century amongst the Victorians. Partly, I think, as a reaction against a world that was seen as increasingly mechanistic, mechanical, and rational.
People are suffering a crisis of faith. Because of the questions that science is raising, people are starting to doubt more and more. And what modern spiritualism offers is empirical evidence, apparently scientific evidence, of an afterlife.
Home and the spiritualist movement, along with their floating bodies and floating tables, kind of fueled the magicians of the later part of the 19th century to reproduce these effects.
The most significant British magician of the day, John Neville Maskelyne, was very quick to exploit the ideas thrown up by this huge interest in the supernatural.
Maskelyne was a pioneer of stage levitation. Unlike the previous effects, which magicians would call suspensions, where you're still in touch with something, this is a free-floating effect where the individual appears to be in touch with nothing whatsoever.
Maskelyne first achieved levitation in 1867 when he caused his wife to rise into the air. She was in a standing position, and then she returned to the stage. The Times wrote in their review, "The lady simply rises directly off the floor where there is no trap and remains suspended, full in the light, with nothing under her feet, over her head, or in any way visibly connected with her."
To see a levitation in the theatre in the 1870s, 1880s must have been an extraordinary experience, because what you were seeing was something that, of course, simply couldn't happen.
When that body starts to float up in the air, and you've got to remember it floated right up in the air and all the way down to the stage. I mean, it was spooky, it was unreal, it would cause women to ask for smelling salts in those days.
Coleridge used the wonderful phrase, the suspension of disbelief, for what happens to audiences generally in the theatre. And that's what an audience, in a way, was doing. It was either suspending its disbelief or having its belief challenged.
A number of the big important spiritualists at the time had claimed to master the art of levitation in the seance room. And Maskelyne always wanted to outdo them.
I think you have to remember how Maskelyne started in magic. He was a clockmaker, or clockmaker or watch repairer, living in Cheltenham in the 1860s. But he was also an amateur magician, a keen amateur magician, and he went to see a spiritualist act called the Davenport Brothers. And they were tied up by members of the audience, but still they would produce a seance. And they said it was all due to spiritualism.
We give to you the spirit cabinet.
One of the Davenport's effects was the levitation of objects whilst they appeared to be tied up inside a cabinet. The day the young Maskelyne went to see the act, he saw something no one else noticed.
The theatre was blacked out, but the curtain, one of the curtains slipped and let some light in, and Maskelyne realised how the tricks were being done. So he stood up, must have been a brash young fellow, he stood up and said, "I can reproduce everything they've done, and it won't be by spiritualism, it will be by magic."
That beam of sunlight was maybe the most important divine intervention in the history of magic, because that's what put John Neville Maskelyne to business.
The young clockmaker and skeptic copied the spiritualists' levitations, but improved upon them.
There were probably 5 or 6 very important, significant Maskelyne levitations. It was a theme he returned to over and over again, and every time he went back to it, he improved it with the real keen eye of a mechanician.
Maskelyne developed this levitation where he himself, in a standing position, rose and floated all the way up to the roof of the theater. It wasn't that high, but any roof is high enough that it'd make you think twice before going up there. But that required a huge amount of mechanism and a huge amount of operation. Very technically complicated, very difficult to operate, and takes great skill for the people backstage who are doing it to keep it synchronized.
Some of these levitations were so impressive that one famous spiritualist actually went to see it and was convinced that Maskelyne had genuine supernatural powers.
Whatever it was, the public were keen to see the shows. Maskelyne was instrumental in creating magic's golden age. Maskelyne and his partner George Cooke took over a theatre in London's Piccadilly. The Egyptian Hall was to become the epicentre of magic in the golden age.
What they call the golden age of magic was about the movement of magic into the theatres, the palaces of varieties, the music halls. And of course, once you move magic into a theatre, then you've got all sorts of new possibilities to play with. You've got control of lighting to a certain extent. You've got controlled sight lines through the use of a proscenium arch stage. You've got pulleys, levers, trapdoors, all sorts of mechanical things that make new kinds of performance possible. In particular, levitation.
The Egyptian Hall was probably a great showplace for a magic show. It was a very small theater. It seated probably just over 200 people. Very tiny stage, about 15 feet wide, which made every performer large and important. Of course, any large illusion, a levitation trick or a disappearing trick, looked fantastic on that stage.
The Egyptian Hall was a high watermark in the world of magic. Finally, there's a theater dedicated to the art of magic, and it captures the imagination of Western magicians who make pilgrimages to this place to see what's brewing up there. It's kind of like the Las Vegas of its time. It's the center, it's the mecca of magic.
John Neville Maskelyne devised what he called playlets, a short sketch, well, not so short in some cases, but a sketch where he weaved the magic into the sketch. And these became very popular as playlets, but really an excuse to do a levitation or a floating of a person.
As the Golden Age progressed,